The immortal vampire king disguises himself as a poor, ragged stranger to see who will love him without his crown, palace, or power. Every woman fails his secret test, chasing riches and beauty, until one kind, overweight woman treats him with genuine care. Her pure heart breaks his curse and proves that real love sees the soul, not status or size. People still whisper about the night the vampire king walked away from his throne in torn clothes, carrying nothing with him except an old secret and a heart more human than anyone imagined. The castle of Nocthane stood above the dark forest like a dream carved from moonlight and stone. Its towers pierced the clouds, its silver windows reflected the stars, and every servant inside moved in careful silence whenever the king passed. To the world, King Lucien was a legend. He was the immortal ruler with eyes like molten gold, skin pale as winter, and a presence so commanding that even the oldest nobles lowered their gaze when he entered a room. But legends are often poor at telling the truth. The truth was that Lucien was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix. It was the deeper kind, the kind that settled in the soul after centuries of watching smiles change when people saw your crown. He had seen admiration, desire, fear, and greed so many times that they had begun to look the same. Women praised his face, his kingdom, his endless wealth, and his power over the night. They called it love, but love should not disappear the moment a jewel is removed or a throne is empty. That evening, a grand banquet filled the castle with music. Crystal glasses shimmered under candlelight. Noble daughters arrived in silk gowns, carrying practiced laughter and perfect posture. The hall smelled of roses, polished wood, honeyed wine, and the cold perfume of ambition. Lucien sat at the head of the long table, expression calm, watching as another family presented their daughter to him as if she were an offering placed before a shrine. One young woman smiled sweetly and said, "Your Majesty, I have always dreamed of serving beside a king as wise and beautiful as you." Lucien studied her face. Her voice was flawless. Her manners were flawless. Even her blush seemed rehearsed. "And if I were neither king nor wealthy?" he asked quietly. She laughed, thinking it a joke. "But you are." That was answer enough. He looked away before she could see the sadness in his eyes. At the far end of the hall, Lord Severin, his oldest advisor, noticed the king's silence and approached carefully when the musicians began their next song. Severin had served the royal bloodline for more than 200 years, and unlike the others, he had earned the right to speak honestly. "You wear that look again," Severin murmured. Lucien swirled the dark liquid in his glass but did not drink. "Which look?" "The one that says the room is full, yet you have never felt more alone." Lucien gave a faint smile. "You always did have a talent for cruelty wrapped in wisdom." "It is only cruel because it is true." Below them, dancers crossed the floor in graceful circles. Gold chandeliers trembled softly above the music. Everything was beautiful. Everything was empty. Lucien leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Severin, in all your years, have you ever seen a person love power less than the person who holds it?" Severin was quiet for a moment. "A rare thing, but rare does not mean impossible." Lucien's gaze sharpened. "Then I will stop searching for love in rooms built to worship crowns." That same night, after the banquet ended and the castle fell into its velvet silence, Lucien stood alone in his private chamber. He removed his rings first, setting them one by one on a black marble table. Then came the jeweled cloak, the silver clasp, the embroidered coat, the polished boots. Layer by layer, the king disappeared. In his place stood a man who looked thin, worn, and almost fragile. He pulled on rough, faded clothes chosen from a trunk no one knew he kept. He rubbed dust into the fabric and tore the sleeve at the shoulder. When he looked into the mirror, he no longer resembled a ruler feared across kingdoms. He looked like someone the world might pass without a second glance. For a long moment, Lucien stared at his own reflection. Without the crown, he looked younger, Stranger, sadder. "Would anyone choose this man," he whispered, "if they knew nothing else?" A voice came from the shadows near the door. "That depends," Severin said, stepping into the moonlight. "Would you let them know him?" Lucien turned. "You disapprove." "I fear what pain may come from this." "So do I." Severin approached and placed a small leather pouch in the king's hand. A few coins, nothing more. "If you are determined to vanish into your own kingdom, at least take enough to survive with dignity." Lucien closed his fingers around the pouch, but did not smile. "I am not looking for comfort." "No," Severin said softly. "You are looking for truth. That is always more dangerous." Just before dawn, the vampire king left through a hidden gate beneath the western tower. No royal carriage waited for him. No guard announced his name. The night wind touched his uncovered face as if greeting a stranger. The forest path beyond the castle was damp from evening rain, and the earth gave softly beneath his boots. Owls called from the branches overhead. Somewhere far off, wolves sang to the fading moon. Lucien walked alone. By sunrise, he had reached the edge of Ebenmere, the largest town in his kingdom. In the palace, he had heard reports about hunger, markets, taxes, festivals, and harvests. But reports had no smell. They had no trembling hands, no children with patched sleeves, no bakers wiping flour from their arms before opening their stalls. Here, the world was warm with bread smoke and horse sweat, fresh apples, muddy carts, ringing hammers, and people who had no idea their king was standing among them in worn-out clothes. It unsettled him more than battle ever had. A fruit seller glanced at him and immediately looked away. A well-dressed merchant wrinkled his nose as Lucien passed. Two boys running through the square nearly crashed into him, then stopped when they saw his ragged shirt. "Sorry, sir," one said quickly. The other tugged his sleeve and whispered, not quietly enough, "He looks haunted." Lucien almost laughed. "That," he said, "is a very fair observation." The boys stared, surprised by his gentle tone, then grinned and ran off again. It was a small moment, but it warmed him unexpectedly. Near the fountain, a crowd had gathered around a street performer juggling bright glass balls while balancing on an old barrel. Lucien paused at the edge of the laughter, half hidden behind a wooden post. The performer lost control of one ball, and it bounced into the crowd. A little girl chased after it, giggling, but her foot caught on the uneven stone. She pitched forward toward the path of an approaching cart. Lucien moved before anyone else did. To human eyes, he was only a blur of rough cloth and pale hands. In the space of a breath, he reached the child, lifted her safely aside, and pulled back just before the cart rolled through. The crowd gasped. The girl stared at him with wide eyes, still clutching the glass ball. "Easy," Lucien said, kneeling to her level. "You have won your race against disaster." She blinked, then smiled. "You talk funny." "I have been told worse." The crowd laughed, and for the first time in many years, Lucien felt something light move through him. Not admiration, not fear, just a shared human moment, brief and honest. The child's mother rushed forward and wrapped her daughter in her arms. When she looked up at Lucien, gratitude filled her face. But then her eyes lowered to his torn clothes. The gratitude remained, though something in it changed. Pity, perhaps, or discomfort. "Thank you," she said, pressing a small coin into his hand. "For your trouble." Lucien looked at the coin resting in his palm. Trouble. He had crossed battlefields. He had negotiated peace between ancient enemies. He had ruled an empire of shadows with mercy strong enough to tame monsters. Yet here, hidden inside rags, he had become a man rewarded for trouble. He should have been offended. Instead, he felt humbled. Maybe this was what truth looked like, when pride was finally stripped away. As the day passed, he saw more than any report had ever shown him. He saw a widow splitting her bread into 3 pieces so her children could each believe they had enough. He saw a blacksmith secretly repair a farmer's broken tool without taking payment. He saw a group of wealthy young women laugh at an old man because his coat smelled of rain and smoke. He saw a baker's apprentice slip a warm pastry into the hands of a hungry boy and pretend not to notice when the boy ran away. The world, he realized, was not divided simply between good and evil. It was divided between those who guarded the dignity of others and those who stepped on it. By late afternoon, clouds rolled across the sky, turning the streets silver with approaching rain. Lucien had spent only 2 of the coins Severin gave him, one on bread, one on a bowl of soup at a tiny inn where no one asked his name. It should have been enough to make him feel ordinary. Instead, it made him feel visible in an entirely different way. No one bowed to him. No one tried to impress him. No one cared who he was. And somehow, that hurt more than he expected. Rain began in cold, slanting lines. Merchants covered their stalls. Horses stamped impatiently. People hurried indoors with baskets over their heads. Lucien stood beneath the awning of a closed tailor's shop and watched the square empty into shadows and wet stone. Then he heard laughter. Not cruel laughter, bright laughter. Across the street, near a struggling flower stand, a fuller-figured young woman in a simple blue dress was trying to rescue a bucket of daisies before the wind tipped it over. Her hair had come loose in the rain, and she was muttering to the flowers as if they were stubborn children. "No, no, no, you dramatic little things," she said, catching the bucket against her hip. "If I am soaked, then you may be soaked, but you may not run away." A nearby boy burst out laughing. She looked up, grinned at him, and bowed as if she had performed on purpose. It was such an ordinary scene, so small, so alive. Lucien found himself watching her longer than he meant to. She was not dressed richly. She was not surrounded by admirers. In fact, when 2 fashionable women passed by, they glanced at her, whispered behind gloved hands, and smiled with the sharp satisfaction of people who measured worth by appearance. The young woman heard them. Lucien could tell by the way her smile flickered. But she did not answer with bitterness. Instead, she gently handed the laughing boy a daisy and said, "Here, someone should leave this rain with something beautiful." The boy beamed and ran off. Lucien felt something unexpected stir in his chest, quiet and unfamiliar. Not desire, not yet. Recognition. Here was someone who had just been wounded and still chose kindness. Thunder rolled across the town. The wind grew stronger. One of the market canopies snapped loose and swung wildly on its ropes. A crate near the flower stand toppled, sending clay pots skidding across the wet stones. The woman stepped back too late. Lucien moved. He caught the flying wooden pole with one hand before it could strike her shoulder. The force of it would have knocked an ordinary man flat, but he absorbed it and shoved the broken frame aside just as the rain came harder. For a brief second, she stared at him in shock. Up close, her eyes were soft brown, wide with surprise, and there was rain gathered on her lashes like tiny beads of glass. "You," she began, breathless, "you just—" Lucien released the pole carefully, hiding his strength beneath the awkward movement of a tired traveler. It seemed rude to let the weather attack you. To his surprise, she laughed. It was warm, unguarded, and so sincere that it nearly disarmed him more than any weapon ever had. "Well," she said, pushing wet hair from her face, "thank you, mysterious stranger. The weather and I have had a difficult relationship all week." He should have walked away then. That had been the plan: observe, test, remain unseen. But something in her expression made him stay. She glanced at his soaked clothes, then at the bread wrapped in cloth under his arm, and whatever she had been about to say changed completely. Her voice softened. "You haven't eaten much today, have you?" Lucien froze. It was such a simple question. No one at court would have thought to ask it. They would have commented on his face, his name, his rank, his power. This woman, standing in the rain with flowers at her feet, had looked at him once and seen hunger. Before he could answer, a tall man from the next stall hurried over, red-faced and annoyed. "Mira, leave it," the man said. "You cannot keep helping every stray soul in the market. You'll go hungry doing it." Mira. The name settled into Lucien's thoughts like a candle, lighting a dark room. She lifted her chin. If kindness made people poor, the rich would all be saints. The man sighed. "You joke now, but you barely sold anything today." Mira bent to gather the fallen flower pots, her arms full, her dress soaked through at the hem. "Then I'll sell tomorrow." Lucien watched her, silent. The man noticed him and lowered his voice, though not enough. "And you," he said, looking Lucien over, "best move along. Storm's getting worse. People around here don't open their doors easily." Lucien might have answered with dignity, or irony, or cool silence. But before he could speak, Mira looked at him again, really looked at him, and said the one thing no one in centuries had ever said to the vampire king of Noxane. "You can come with me if you want. It's not much, but it's warm." Lightning flashed across the square. The rain seemed to pause around that moment, as if the entire world were waiting for his answer. Lucien stood motionless, the storm cold on his skin, his hidden identity hanging by a breath, while the first person who had truly seen his need held open the fragile door to a life he had never known. And for the first time since leaving his throne, the immortal king was afraid to take the next step. Some moments look small from the outside, but later you realize your entire life turned on that one step you almost didn't take. For Lucien, it was the step he took out of the rain, following a stranger who had offered him warmth without asking for a single thing in return. He nodded once to Mira, more to himself than to her, and crossed the flooded street. The storm grabbed at his cloak like cold fingers, but when he reached her side, everything felt a little quieter. She smiled as if his decision had solved a problem she'd been secretly worried about. "Come on," she said, lifting her skirts from the wet ground. "If we stay out here, the river will adopt us." They walked through narrow lanes where water ran in silver streams between the stones. The town smelled of wet earth, chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of crushed flowers clinging to Mira's dress. Lucien kept his stride careful, forcing himself to move like an ordinary man, not like a creature who could cross a battlefield in the span of a blink. "What should I call you?" Mira asked over the sound of the rain. "Unless you prefer mysterious stranger who fights broken market stalls." He hesitated. The name Lucien carried too much history, too many stories. "Luke," he said finally. It felt strange on his tongue, like a shirt that almost fit. "Just Luke." "Just Luke," she repeated, as though she were testing how it tasted too. "I'm Mira. You already heard that, but it's polite to say it properly." They turned a corner and stopped in front of a small stone building pressed between a bakery and a quiet bookshop. The window above the bakery glowed softly, fogged at the edges from the heat inside. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread and roasted grain, so warm it seemed to wrap around them like a blanket. "My palace," Mira said with a mock bow. Inside, the bakery's owner, a stout older woman, glanced up from kneading dough. Her eyes lingered on Lucien's torn clothes, but she said nothing when Mira led him up a creaking wooden staircase to a modest room under the roof. The room was small but full of life. Dried herbs hung from a string across the window. A chipped vase held 3 surviving daisies from the stall. A faded quilt covered a narrow bed, and in the corner, a little iron stove ticked softly with leftover heat. There were flaws everywhere, cracked plaster, a leaning bookshelf, shoes tucked under a chair, but together they formed a kind of gentle, stubborn comfort. Mira lit a candle and glanced at him, suddenly shy. "It isn't much, but the roof only leaks in heroic storms, and the mice pay rent in company." Lucien looked around slowly, taking it in. At the castle, entire halls glowed with untouched gold. Here, nothing matched, yet everything had been touched by her hands. "It is honest," he said. Her shoulders relaxed at that. "Honest is good. I can afford honest." She set a pot on the stove and poured in the last of a thick vegetable soup. The smell of onions, garlic, and herbs filled the room. Lucien watched the steam rise and realized with a quiet start that it had been a very long time since anyone had cooked for him, not because they were paid to obey him, but because they wanted to make sure he ate. "Sit," Mira said, gesturing to the small table. "You look like the rain tried to drown you." He sat. The chair creaked under his weight, but held. When she placed a bowl of soup before him, he hesitated for just a heartbeat. As a vampire, food was not a need, but centuries of court etiquette had trained him to move smoothly through human rituals. Still, it felt strangely intimate to raise that simple wooden spoon. He took a small sip. The taste was nothing grand, no rare spices, no expensive wine, but it was warm, and it had been made by hands that cared. Somehow, that made it richer than any feast he could remember. Mira watched him anxiously. "Is it all right? It might be too salty, or too watery, or both. I'm very talented at creating new disasters in pots." Lucien searched for a word that didn't sound like a king reviewing a chef. "It tastes like someone tried." She laughed. "Best review I've had all year." While they ate, she talked in the easy, wandering way of someone who had spent many evenings alone and had stored story after story, waiting for a safe person to share them with. She told him about her mother, who had taught her the names of flowers and how to braid courage into everyday life. She spoke of her father, who had died 3 winters ago when the fever swept through the poorer districts, leaving behind debts and an old stall no one wanted to buy. "And now it's just me and the flowers," she said, wrapping both hands around her bowl. "The rent is too high, the days are too long, and every time I sit down, I discover I've crushed one more petal in my skirts. But at least I know what I'm waking up for." Lucien studied her quietly. The room's single candle traced soft light along the curve of her cheek, catching on the little scars life had left on her hands. She was not delicate in the way the court defined beauty. She took up space, real, unapologetic space, and the world around her adjusted rather than shrinking her to fit. "People don't always like that," she added with a small smile that didn't quite hide the old wounds beneath it. "They say I'm too big for a flower cellar, too loud, too visible." "What do you say?" he asked. "I say I'm exactly the right size to carry my own life." She shrugged, trying to make it sound light. "And if someone can't see past my shape, then their world is too small, not mine." The words settled deep inside him. In the palace, others had often treated him like an idea, the immortal, the vampire king, rather than a person. Now here sat a woman who had been reduced to an outline in the minds of others, yet still refused to live smaller for their comfort. He found himself speaking more honestly than he had planned. "Where I come from," he said carefully, "people also judge by what shines. Names, titles, power. They forget that all of it can disappear in a single night." Mira tilted her head. "Is that why you left? Because the shining things weren't real?" Lucien stirred his soup, trying to look like a man searching for words rather than a king hiding from them. "I served in a great house," he said, not entirely a lie. "I watched people bow and smile and plot. After a while, I needed to know if any kindness existed outside of performance." "So you walked away with nothing?" Her eyebrows rose. "That's either very brave or very foolish." "Which do you think?" he asked. "Ask me when I see whether you survive the week," she replied, but her eyes were gentle. "For now, I think it's lonely." Something in his chest tightened. "It has been." They fell into a quiet that wasn't awkward, just full. The storm softened outside, turning from anger to a steady, tired rain. Mira yawned, covering her mouth quickly. "You can have the bed," she said. "I'll take the chair." Lucien shook his head immediately. "No, I do better with less sleep than most. Keep your bed." "You'll be uncomfortable." "I have been uncomfortable before." She studied him for a moment, as if measuring the weight behind that simple sentence, then nodded. "All right, just Luke. But if you turn into a frozen statue by morning, I'll feel guilty forever." When she finally lay down, the small room grew even smaller with the sound of her breathing. Lucien sat in the chair by the window, watching the candle burn low. He did not sleep. He rarely needed to. Instead, he opened the window just enough to hear the city breathe. Voices drifted up from the street below. Two men walking home late, speaking in low tones. "Say the king's gone," one muttered. "Vanished from his silver tower." "Good riddance," the other scoffed. "Vampire on the throne, pretending to care for us. Now the council will have to show its face." Lucien's hands tightened on the armrests. "Or things get worse," the first man said. "No one to hold them back. I heard they're already raising taxes. My brother can barely keep his shop as it is." The voices faded around the corner, leaving only the rain and the distant creak of wagon wheels. So his absence had already rippled this far. He had left to find something true, but truth, it seemed, came with a price he had not fully counted. Somewhere, nobles he barely trusted were using his disappearance to tighten their grip on people like Mira. A flash of movement at his side made him turn. Mira, half asleep, had stretched out an arm as if searching for something. Her hand brushed against his sleeve. Her fingers closed for a second, gentle and unknowing, and she murmured his name, a quiet, slurred Luke, before her hand fell back onto the quilt. It was such a small, unconscious reach. But to a man who had been bowed to by thousands and touched by almost no one, it felt like the heaviest thing in the room. Outside, armor clinked faintly. Lucien looked down into the street again and saw 3 riders in the king's colors. Even stripped down for rain, he recognized the cut of their cloaks, the familiar pattern of the saddles. One of them nailed a parchment to the tavern wall with a sharp crack that echoed in the night. A royal decree. Even from this distance, Lucien could imagine the words. Notice of reward. Missing king. Report any strangers. The riders moved on, their horses' hooves splashing through puddles, their torches leaving streaks of orange behind them. Lucien stayed frozen by the window, Mira's unintentional touch still warming his sleeve, while duty and desire pulled him in opposite directions so fiercely that, for the first time in centuries, he didn't know which part of himself would win. And as the royal sigil dripped rain on the tavern wall below, he realized with a slow, dawning fear that if he chose wrong, the person who would pay the highest price might not be him at all. The next morning arrived wrapped in the smell of bread and the sound of someone humming off-key. Lucien opened his eyes to see Mira standing by the stove, hair piled into a messy bun, dress freshly changed, tapping a wooden spoon against a pot as if it were a drum. "You survived the chair," she asked without turning around. "No frozen statue." "I remain mostly human," he answered, stretching more for appearance than need. "Good, I've decided to hire you." He blinked. "Hire me." She looked over her shoulder, lips twitching. "My flower stall needs a temporary assistant. Pay is terrible, hours are long, and you'll be regularly scolded by old women about the way you tie ribbon. Interested." He should have refused. He should have left before the royal decree reached her street. Instead, something warm and reckless answered for him. "Yes." "Excellent." She set a small plate of bread and cheese on the table. "Breakfast for my newest victim." They walked to the market together beneath a sky still heavy with leftover rain. The world looked washed, colors deeper, corners sharper. Children skipped over puddles. Bakers shouted their first prices of the day. The air smelled of yeast, wet stone, and hope cautiously returning. At the stall, Mira handed him a bundle of twine and showed him how to bind small bouquets. Her hands moved quickly, confidently, weaving stems and leaves into simple, sturdy arrangements. "Don't worry about perfection," she said. "Flowers don't mind being a little crooked. They're like people that way." He tried to copy her motions, concentration making his brow furrow. The twine broke twice, and one bouquet ended up pointing in every possible direction. Mira laughed, not unkindly. "That one looks like it recently survived a storm and is now telling everyone about it." "An honest bouquet," he replied. "We should charge extra." People drifted toward the stall. Some came for flowers, some for Mira's easy conversation. A few looked Lucien over with curiosity, asking the polite questions strangers always ask. "Where are you from? How long are you staying?" He offered vague answers and let Mira distract them with jokes. Not everyone was kind. Two young women in bright dresses paused nearby, their parasols spinning lazily. "Look," one whispered not low enough. "Mira found a charity case." The other smirked. She should be grateful anyone stands that close to her, all that space. Her eyes swept over Mira's full figure with cruel precision. It must be hard to see the flowers behind her. Lucien felt his jaw tighten. He waited for Mira to snap back, but she only smiled thinly and turned away, busying herself with a vase that didn't need adjusting. When the women left, he spoke softly. "Why let them talk that way?" She tied a ribbon with more force than necessary. "Because arguing would only make them louder, and because I have better things to do than teach empty minds how to be full." "But it hurts," he said. She looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "Yes," she admitted. "Some days more than others. But if I stopped living every time someone thought I took up too much room, I'd disappear. And I refuse to disappear for anyone." He absorbed her words, feeling their truth settle alongside his own hidden life. He, too, had refused to disappear, but in a very different way. By taking the throne, by accepting the crown, by turning his immortality into a shield for others. And now, by stepping away from it all, he might have left people like Mira more exposed than ever. Before he could answer, a sudden shout cut through the market. "Hear ye, royal decree." A town crier climbed onto the fountain's edge, unrolling a parchment sealed with the sigil Lucien knew too well. The crowd fell into a restless hush. "By order of the High Council," the crier announced, voice ringing across the square, "King Lucien of Nocthane has been declared missing. Any person with knowledge of his whereabouts must come forward at once. A generous reward awaits those who aid in his safe return." Murmurs spread like wind over tall grass. "Missing? How does a king go missing?" Maybe the sunlight finally caught him. "I heard he was taken by enemies across the sea." No, another voice added. "My cousin's wife works in the lower kitchens. She said the king was different, softer. Maybe he ran away." Lucien kept his head down, fingers curling around a bucket's metal handle until it groaned. The crier continued. "Until His Majesty returns, the council will oversee all matters of law and tax. Increased collections will begin next week to ensure the kingdom's stability in this uncertain time." There it was, the cost of his search for truth, written in ink and loud authority. Beside him, Mira exhaled slowly. "So they'll take more from us to protect the power of men we never see." She shook her head. "Sometimes I think the castle is another world, not just another hill." "What do you think of the king?" Lucien asked carefully. She considered the question, wiping rainwater from a crate. "Honestly, I don't know. I've heard he's kinder than the old lords were, that he keeps monsters away from the borders, that he forgave debts after the fever. But I've also heard he's a vampire who never walks our streets, never looks us in the eyes, never listens when prices rise and wages don't. Her gaze shifted to the parchment hanging by the fountain, the royal sigil bleeding slightly as the paper absorbed moisture. I suppose he's like a story, she said. Half hope, half fear. Useful at night when children are scared, but very far away when the roof leaks. And if he stood in front of you, Lucien asked, the air suddenly too tight in his lungs, what would you say to him? Mira laughed once without much humor. I'd say, "Good evening, Your Majesty. I don't care what you drink or how long you've lived. I care whether the people down here can afford bread." And then I'd probably ask him why kings and rich men love hiding behind masks and titles. Her eyes softened. Lies hurt people, you know, especially when they come from someone you chose to trust. The words struck with quiet precision. Lies hurt people you chose to trust. Lucien looked away, afraid she might see too much in his face. Later, the market buzz grew louder again, but there was a nervous edge under the noise now. News of increased taxes spread quickly. Some shoppers clutched their coins tighter, others walked away without buying, shoulders heavy with calculations. Mira sold fewer flowers than usual. She tried to smile, but the corners of her mouth drooped when she thought no one was looking. In the afternoon, trouble arrived in the shape of polished boots and a self-satisfied stride. Captain Roderick of the town watch approached the stall with 2 guards at his side. He was a broad man with a neat beard and the expression of someone who enjoyed reminding others of their place. Lucien had met hundreds like him in court, men who hid weakness behind borrowed power. Mira, Roderick said, tapping the edge of the table with his gloved fingers. You're late with last month's street fee. Mira straightened. I paid 2 days ago. Not according to my records. He gestured vaguely to his chest, where no records existed. And with the new decree, fees have gone up. Protection costs more in difficult times. Protection from what? She asked quietly. From rain, from customers who try to pay full price. A few nearby vendors tried to hide their smiles. Roderick leaned in, voice dropping. From troublemakers, from strangers who don't belong. The council is very interested in unknown faces right now. His eyes slid toward Lucien, particularly ones who appear right before a royal announcement. Lucien felt Mira stiffen beside him. He's a traveler, she said. Helping out at my stall, that's all. Roderick's gaze roamed over Lucien's worn clothes and pale face, then returned to Mira with a smirk. You always were soft-hearted, dangerous trait in times like these. You never know what kind of man hides behind rags. Besides, his voice sharpened, a woman like you should be grateful anyone bothers staying near her, king or beggar. Not many palaces make room for so much extra. The words hung in the air like a slap. Several people looked away, embarrassed for her. 1 or 2 chuckled under their breath, eager to stand beside power rather than decency. Mira's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin, swallowing whatever emotion clawed at her throat. She began to reach for her coin pouch with shaking fingers. Lucien stepped between them. The movement was calm, almost slow, but something in it made Roderick pause. The captain found himself staring into eyes that, for a fraction of a second, caught the light like molten gold. Is there a problem? Lucien asked, voice soft. Roderick scoffed, trying to recover the easy arrogance. This is town business, stranger. Step aside. Lucien didn't move. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of long years spent commanding armies and councils, even though his clothes said otherwise. I have walked in many places, he said quietly. I have seen what happens when men use fear as a ladder and other people's dignity as the rungs. It never ends well for them. Roderick's smirk faltered. Are you threatening me? Lucien simply held his gaze. For a heartbeat, the sounds of the market seemed to fade. A cool wind slid through the square. The guards shifted nervously, hands brushing their weapons without drawing them. There was no open threat, no raised voice, yet Roderic's pulse kicked up, a primal part of him recognizing something old and dangerous behind those tired, pale features. He stepped back, forcing a laugh. "Keep your charity case, Mira, but remember, I'll be watching. The council rewards those who bring them answers." He turned sharply and strode away, guards hurrying after him. The crowd slowly exhaled. A few people nodded to Lucien in silent thanks before returning to their stalls. The ordinary rhythm of buying and selling resumed, but the air felt different, charged, like the air after lightning. Mira stared at Lucien, as if seeing him for the first time. "You made him walk away," she said, voice low. "Roderick doesn't back down, not from anyone." "I did nothing," Lucien answered carefully. "Sometimes bullies trip over their own shadows." She didn't smile. Instead, she reached out and touched his wrist. Her fingers were warm, firm, and her gaze searched his face with a focus that made his heart beat harder, though it hadn't needed to beat in centuries. "When he spoke to me like that," she said slowly, "you looked different, your eyes, your voice. For a moment, you sounded like someone used to giving orders, not someone used to sleeping in a chair." He tried to pull back lightly, but she held on, not willing to let the question slide away. "Luke," she whispered, fear and something more tangled together in her tone. "What are you not telling me?" The bustle of the market blurred around them. Somewhere, a child laughed. A bell rang the hour. But in that small space between her hand and his, everything narrowed to a single, unspoken truth hanging trembling in the air. Lucien opened his mouth, caught between the life he had always known and the fragile, ordinary joy he had just begun to taste. And for the first time since he walked out of his castle, the Vampire King had no idea which answer would break her heart less.